Chapter 3: The Religious Challenge. Indian activists holding religious ceremonies in the BIA building, concluding their stay by looting the building, seems incongruous and ridiculous, unless we probe deeper into the nature of the relationship between Indians and whites. Indian activists accused of fomenting the destruction made a rather weak reply. What about the rape of the North American continent and the destruction of tribal cultures, the wasteful use of human beings, the deprivation of rights to a helpless minority? Do not these crimes make the destruction of a building pale in significance? They asked. Do they? In one sense, the capture and destruction of the BIA headquarters was a historic anachronism. Watts burned in 1965. The urban areas seized and burned following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Was not the Indian occupation of a federal building in the nation's capital an event dreadfully out of time? Was not the sacking of the BIA headquarters and the occupation of Wounded Knee the final spasm of the rugged 1960s, when any type of change was considered beneficial, and the institutions of society were considered not only obsolete, but malignant? Perhaps it was the last hurrah of an era when people could thumb their noses at established authority without fear of painful reprisal. But the Indian incidents must also be seen within the context of the Indian experience in this nation's history, and in that context the Indian movement raised an entirely different kind of question, that of religion rather than the equal enforcement of the law. There certainly was an aspect in which the Indian protests were events of the 1960s. Although occurring in 1972 and 1973. Since 1968, the major Christian denominations had been pouring funds into social movements of all kinds. They believed deeply in the militant interpretation of black power, as continuous confrontations and grants were made to organizations within the respective minority groups that they were sure would produce the desired protests. A group that snapped and snarled about its social problems stood a much better chance of receiving funds from the churches than did a group that calmly and carefully articulated a problem that they hoped to solve. Church officials often gauged their relevancy in proportion to the violence of the groups they were funding. Any church not receiving its share of frothing at the mouth demands for money felt isolated from the great events of the American social movement. Thus, it was that when AIM captured a dormitory in Augustana College and Sioux Falls, and presented a set of demands carefully worked out by sympathetic Lutherans in secret sessions, the Lutheran churches eagerly embraced the Indian cause. While they had not been overly enthusiastic about helping the blacks during the civil rights movement, some church officials felt that they could get the same kind of action from the Indians without taking a position on a social movement that would antagonize their church members. Many Lutherans were ecstatic when informed by Indians that they were guilty of America's sin against the Indians, and they embarked on a massive program of fundraising to pay for their alleged sins. But they were not only the victims, because the Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the Congregationalists all gleefully responded to the accusation that they had been responsible for nearly all of the problems of American Indians. They also decided that they could purchase indulgences for these sins by funding the Indian activists to do whatever they felt necessary to correct the situation. By early 1971, almost every major Christian church had set up crisis funds to buy off whichever Indian protesters they might arrange to have visit them. Confrontations escalated as each group sought to become more relevant than its competitors, and the path toward destruction was clearly visible to everyone. In a real sense, Christian churches bought and paid for the Indian movement and its climactic destruction of the BIA headquarters, as surely as if they had written out specific orders to sack the BIA on a contractual basis. Not every Indian protest, however, was inspired by the financial rewards to be gained from the churches by playing the protest game. Many of the incidents were valid protests by a people who had suffered too much for too long. Even more, younger Indians had seen in the civil rights movement that the institutions of this country respond only when there is a threat to their property, or when disorder in their lives forces them to confront problems that have not been solved for generations. Yet the civil rights issue was peripheral at best when understood in the Indian context. The different tribal groups, suffered discrimination and prejudice generally, but more specifically the broken treaties meant immediate hardship for the different communities. Could young Indians enter a civil rights movement and press for removal of discriminatory hiring practices while enjoying preference under federal law for employment in tribal programs based on treaties and agreements? Major institutional differences really did exist among American racial minorities. Few Indians ever accepted the premises of the civil rights movement. If the tribal chairman demanded the prosecution of the Indian militants following the departure from the destroyed BIA building, it was a weak response compared to tribal reactions on being asked to join in the civil rights movement and marches half a decade earlier. That the basic goals of the civil rights movement could not attract more than a handful of Indians at any one time should give pause to everyone. What was it that turned Indians off other than the fear that they might be identified with blacks as a minority group? American history gives us a partial answer and allows us to raise certain questions that must be asked. The civil rights movement was probably the last full-scale effort to realize the avowed goals of the Christian religion. For more than a century, the American political system had proclaimed the brotherhood of man as seen politically in the concepts of equality of opportunity and justice, equally administered under the law. Equality under the law, however, was a secularized and generalized interpretation of the Christian brotherhood of man. The universal appeal of individuals standing equally before God, now seen as people standing equally before the law and secular institutions. While the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, NAACP, Legal Defense, and Education Fund fought a series of brilliant court battles leading up to the great Supreme Court decisions, in the background certainly lurked the great Christian message of the brotherhood of man. A majority of Americans rejected this secular version of the brotherhood and sought to prevent its realization because of long-standing attitudes that people of color were necessarily inferior. When the struggle in the South reached the point of open boycotts and nonviolent protests, it was the black Christian church leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Andrew Young, who spearheaded the movement by translating Christian doctrines into political tools of resistance and eventually conquest. In large measure, the civil rights movement was a movement that found its ideology, strategy, and meaning in Christian religious doctrines. King's famous letter from jail in Birmingham was not addressed to the political leaders of the South or to liberals of the North, but to the Christian church leaders of the South, who were intent on reducing the Christian religion to a comforting and spineless recital of creeds. There had to be a point in Western history at which the avowed beliefs of the Christian religion were placed on the agenda to discover if they could become a reality. Could Western Christianity practice the tenets that all people are created equal and that thou shalt not kill? The civil rights movement became the acid test in the field of domestic relations. Before the civil rights movement, however, one must look at the Nuremberg trials as the moment history in which Western Christianity achieved its greatest influence. In those trials, the victorious Allied nations presumed to speak for all of civilization and judged the Nazi leaders not as losers, but as those who had violated the basic tenets of civilized and religious existence. In setting themselves up as judges, the Western nations had first to overlook the atrocities of their Russian allies, and secondly, affirm before all societies that they themselves stood sinless before all and before history, and were fit to judge. Amen. After the Nuremberg trials, it became more or less inevitable that the Western nations would fall victim to the moral and intellectual weaknesses in their own societies. Could one really judge Nazi leaders when in one's own nation captured German prisoners of war received better treatment than the black soldiers who had captured them? No, the civil rights movement was inevitable. Once the Nuremberg trials had taken place, the logic of national identity called for an effort to realize the reality of Christian religion on a political basis. America had no choice but to embark eventually on a quest for post-Nuremberg meaning. That the civil rights movement began under the benign Eisenhower administration was an indication of the terrible conflicts in which America and its religious sensitivity would engage. If nothing else, Eisenhower personified the good citizen, the American Christian gentleman, the man to whom all good accrues because of his faithful adherence to the American credo. That Dwight D. Eisenhower was compelled by the logic of the law to order federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, over the protests of members of his party, and the South to enforce a Supreme Court decree, seems ironic yet appropriate for the unveiling of the American religious question and its resolution. It was this terrible inconsistency that many Indians sensed as they approached the civil rights movement. In attempting to distinguish Indian issues from the concerns felt by the black community and understood by their white allies, many Indians began to discover their own culture. They began to trace out the reality of their own religious experiences and to distinguish between the technological superiority of the white man and his moral corruption and the falsity of his religious facade. It was during the Eisenhower years that some of the religious ceremonies of the tribes were first openly performed after many decades of suppression. Through the 1960s, the civil rights movement gained power and strength, calling millions of people to commitments that many had never considered making. One cannot but review the many martyrs of the civil rights movement, black and white, to understand the violence of the time and many religious people's depth of commitment. From the era came writers such as Malcolm Boyd and Harvey Cox, who, in retrospect, appear as valiant pioneers, discerning a break in the ecclesiastical curtain, yet committed and powerless to break out of the deteriorating situation. Their books show a desperate effort to leapfrog American domestic theology and make it speak to the times that were unfolding. The Secular City, for example, tries to impress upon the mainstream religious community the fact that secularization has all but overtaken them in a tidal wave of change. Perhaps the civil rights movement held too much promise of a better society. The fervor it inspired in people could not be maintained in the face of exhausting sacrifices for a few intangible accomplishments. Within it was the implicit promise that a better society was but a short distance into the future, and the reality of that society became a means of sustaining the broken heads and broken spirits of the movement. For many young people not in the social movements, the goal of discovering a reality to existence took a different track. In the middle 1960s, also saw the rise of the drug culture in an immediate release from the complexities of modern life. Timothy Leary's admonition to drop out, turn on, and tune in. That's not right. Drop out, turn on, and tune in. Oh, sorry, distracted. I thought he said it a different way. spoke of the same stability of reality in the religious field as did King's dream of a just society, but it was predicated on the idea of an individual isolation and a refusal to accept citizenship responsibilities. As the two movements began to intertwine, the formation of a counterculture was suggested as a means of explaining the apparent alienation between the two general modes of American existence. King spoke out against Vietnam. Suddenly, a new international dimension impinged upon the consciousness of America. True to his Christian ideals, King saw the pervading nature of racism and oppression that led directly from the Christian idea of history, that we were in Southeast Asia at all derived directly from our conception of ourselves as guardians of history against all movements that would upset the balance we had achieved by military and economic power alone. King saw that there could be no solution to domestic problems without a solution to international problems, and solving international problems meant giving up the Western interpretation of history and the role of Western nations in history. Stokely Carmichael burst on the scene with his cry, Black Power, and the question of community integrity dominated conceptions of measuring social change. No longer was it possible to pass civil rights laws. Now the political and economic stranglehold over local communities had to be surrendered. The idea of forming a unified and homogeneous nation vanished as blacks demanded the right to dissent culturally, and other groups, as if waiting for a signal, charged into the breach in the ideology of integration. Christianity had been built on the individual response to external events, as verified by internal feelings of righteousness and satisfaction. A universal brotherhood of responsible citizens had been conceived, in which, with every person acting responsibly in the civil realm, no rupture of the social fabric would occur. Now it was all gone. In its place stood the racial and ethnic communities, demanding the right to national existence in a melting pot society where there was to be neither Jew nor Gentile. Finally, the ecologists arrived with predictions so chilling as to frighten the strongest heart. At the present rate of deterioration, they told us, mankind could expect only a generation before the species would be finally extinguished. How had this situation come about? Some ecologists told us that it was the old Christian idea of nature, the rejection of creation as a living ecosystem, and the concept of nature as depraved, an object for exploitation, and nothing more. Almost immediately, young whites who were attracted by ecology were accused of copping out on the civil rights movement. A diversion, black activists cried, a means of taking the pressure off the corporate governmental structures that refused to give us our rights. What happened in the 1960s and 1970s is that, in all probability, the logic of Western culture and the meaning of the Christian worldview that supported the institutions of Western culture were outrun by the events of the time. The brotherhood of man may be a noble ideal, but it can be achieved in any society that is not homogeneous. Probably not, we discovered. At a certain point in the struggle for realization, it became apparent that goals of the civil rights movement could not be achieved because people did not subscribe to them, and because the goals were, after all, abstract projections of an ideal world, not descriptions of a real world. The collapse of the civil rights movement, the concern with Vietnam and the war, the escape to drugs, the rise of power movements, and the return to Mother Earth can all be understood as desperate efforts of groups of people to flee abstract articulations of belief and superficial values and find authenticity wherever it could be found. It was at this point that Indians became popular, and the widespread and intense interest in Indians, as seen in the fantasy literature and anthologies, seemed to indicate that Americans wanted more from Indians than they did from other minority groups. For many people, the stoic, heroic, and noble Indians who had lived an idyllic existence prior to the contact with whites seemed to hold the key to survival and promised to provide new meanings for American life. Although Americans who held this view were fooling themselves, they knew what they wanted. Indians who saw this interest doubly fooled themselves, because they came to believe that the people were interested in them, and not in the intangible experiences that they thought to represent. Thus, during the early 1970s and until the mid-1980s, at every meeting and convention, Indian spokespersons were proudly announcing that the ensuing calendar year would truly be the Year of the Indian. Ecological advertisements featured Indians paddling or walking across polluted streams and fields with tears running down their faces. Indians were ecstatic, and badly mistaken. And people began to inquire about the basic values of Indian life and articulated their version of it to the very Indians they were quizzing. About all the Indians could do was agree and try their best to make corrections that would not insult their white friends or erode their apparent beliefs in things Indian. The events of the summer of 1971 should have had much more impact on Indians than they did. Finding a nationwide propensity of whites who wished to dig up Indian graves should have frightened most Indians. Many years before, William Carlos Williams wrote, "The land, don't you feel it? Doesn't it make you want to go out and lift dead Indians tenderly from their graves, to steal from them, as if it must be clinging, even to their corpses, some authenticity?" And of course, on an unconscious level, that was precisely what whites did in 1971. That Christian peoples, or even quasi-Christian peoples, could commit such outrages is a measure of their spiritual desperation and unconscious yearning for a feeling of authenticity and emotional stability. But even if these gravediggers, posing as amateur archaeologists, were not Christian, how could the true Christians not have seen the danger in embracing a foreign creed and raised their voices in protest of these acts? By 1978, the interest in traditional religions was so intense that many experienced older Indians characterized the former activists as the Indian version of Jesus freaks. Indeed, the late 1970s saw many Americans, Indian and non-Indian, blindly accept various kinds of religious doctrines without the slightest bit of critical appraisal. It was during those confusing days, we must remember, that the Jonestown tragedy took place. Many Indians who had formerly been Christians of one persuasion or another used the Western format as a means of expressing their devotion, and some former AIM members flying into Rapid City so they could take part in the Pine Ridge Sundance, compared the Sundance with taking communion in the Christian denomination, a parallel that had absolutely no validity whatsoever. In the 1980 presidential elections, the Western religious fundamentalists right-flexed its muscle and elected Ronald Reagan, who stumbled through a confession that yes, indeed, he believed he had a conversion experience and therefore deserved their votes. While the Indian correlate to the surging religious right was to be found in various Indian communities, it did not have the grim, unrelenting intolerance that characterized the white fundamentalist movement. Instead, young Indians began to specialize in ways highly reminiscent of people in the old days who achieved through visions or hard work, expertise, and various badly needed community skills. Only on at the fringes of Indian society, where zealous non-Indians sought to participate, was there any friction. Otherwise, the elders were greatly heartened to see the next generation adopting traditional values and customs so readily. In ideological terms, this contrast between Indian and non-Indian religious revival presents a fascinating picture. American whites are victims of a process long predicted. Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren A. Kierkegaard, European philosophers of the 19th century. Both foresaw that a tragic breakdown in both vision and values was occurring in the psyche of Westerners. For Kierkegaard, the solution to the problem became the exercise of an incredible power of will that he thought would lead Western peoples back to the fundamental realities as he saw them, advocating that the individual must have purity of heart, a celerity and well-disciplined march toward an identifiable goal. Kierkegaard believed that goodness would naturally follow the good if one so willed it. Nietzsche announced the death of God long before the Anglican bishop John Robinson. Nietzsche's alternative was the creation of the Superman, the will to power in this instance being the complete development of human powers and all talents possible. While Nietzsche saw this thrust as an individual decision, the language and temper of his ideas could easily be found in the ecstatic and demonic rantings of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, that simply insisted that the German people were supermen. Unfortunately, these philosophies of will always seem to affect the ordinary citizens by vesting them with an extraordinarily destructive idea of racial superiority. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche attempted to solve the problem of decay inherent with the passage of time within the Western vision of the world by using the Avis approach. Try harder by doing the same things that are now outmoded but still seem reasonable. A more common-sense approach to bolstering Western fortunes and moral failures came in the early years of this century when Walter Rauschenbusch, 1861 to 1918, and others promulgated the theology of social gospel. They visualized the fulfillment of the Christian kingdom on earth in the social reform movements of the muckraker era of American politics: labor organization, restrictive child labor laws, pure food laws, unemployment compensation, and greatly enhanced educational opportunities became for them the realization of the Western people's potential for creating a heavenly society without divine intervention. The New Deal came closer than any other administration in realizing this vision, but the onset of World War II short-circuited its efforts. When the social gospel was brought into full confrontation with the American political system in the civil rights movement, and there was plenty of social gospel ideology in the war on poverty, traditional Protestant theology thwarted its realization. While advances were made in civil rights legislation, particularly in the areas of education, employment, voting rights, and housing, most Americans allowed their racial prejudices to overcome their sense of compassion. The first round of retrenchment came with the Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, Billy Graham theology of unquestioning submission to political decisions and the intense concentration of religious energy on achieving a personal relationship with God. Later, this distinction was almost completely erased during Ronald Reagan's term as president, when the values inherent in the personal relationship turned out to be identical to the racist pandering of the Republican Party for white voters. George Bush sabotaged constructive social legislation, affirmative action, civil rights commission, etc., appointed conservative but hardly scholarly Supreme Court justices, and used subliminal racial themes in his campaigns and speeches. It was no accident that Willie Horton, a black man, became the symbol of the alleged Dukakis position of Michael Dukakis of being soft on crime. Some non-Indian writers detected a turning point in the mid-1970s. Gary Wills, in two books, Nixon Agonistis and Bare Ruined Choirs, found sufficient reason to believe that a turn toward secularism within religion itself had taken place. James Michener, usually noted for long sprawling historical novels about locations, projected a search for a new conception of our position in social history, finding a religious dimension about to be revealed in A Quality of Life. Harvey Cox confronted secularism head-on with The Secular City, and seemed to predict that creature of the Reagan years, the greedy yuppie who had to have it all now. A very naive interpretation of the underlying changes was found in Charles Reich's The Greening of America, which conceived of a benign corporate America, transformed by the entrance of movement people into the business world. More to the point, Alvin Toffler's Future Shock and Vance Packard's A Nation of Strangers forecast the impact on American behavior once computers, the population, explosion, dwindling resources, and the change in sexual attitudes really took hold. Toffler and Packard were particularly worried about the increase in the rate of activity on people, apart from other predicted developments. Could increasing speed in communications and the flow of information and constant migration include the same religious convictions about the world that people held 2 centuries ago? Non-Indian Americans is fragmented during the past 2 decades. A small portion of people entered the New Age that has been a smorgasbord of religious experiences, derived from any tradition willing to advocate its beliefs, and whatever experiences could be packaged for sale to American consumers. Thus, astrology, numerology, flying saucers with heavenly space brothers, past life regressions, a variety of martial arts techniques, various brands of shamanism, and modern versions of witchcraft fill the empty hours of the affluent fringe groups who reject Christianity but want to have some hold on religious experiences. An increasing number of Americans have become members of the religious right, the fundamentalists, as mainline churches lose membership rapidly through their constant efforts to pander to the unchurched and make themselves relevant. Mindless fundamentalism makes amazing strides, even among the educated people in society. When the fundamentalists seized on abortion as an issue, they found the key to political power. Thus was created the irony of modern American life. The fundamentalists could care less about human life after birth. They unquestioningly accept American military ventures around the world and cry for more blood with each invasion or carpet bombing of small countries. They steadfastly support the death penalty and see nothing wrong with its one-sided application to racial minorities. They close their eyes to blatant theft of American assets by government officials, savings and loan executives, and bankers, and oppose every social program that is proposed. Yet on the abortion issue, they wax eloquent about the sanctity of human life as if their salvation depends on it. Thus, through nearly 2 decades, while American Indians were rediscovering the integrity of their traditional religions, the rest of American society has torn itself and its religious traditions apart, substituting patriotism and hedonism for old values and behaviors. Why was it so easy for American Indians to recapture the essence of their religious life, and so difficult for non-Indians to regain a measure of religious experience and stability? Albert Camus explored death and suicide in The Rebel, and gave an incisive analysis of the Western religious problem that bears examining. The profound conflict in this century is perhaps not so much between the German ideologies of history and Christian political ideologies of history and Christian political concepts, which in a certain way are accomplices, as between German dreams and Mediterranean traditions. In other words, between history and nature. Christianity, no doubt, was only able to conquer its Catholicity by assimilating as much as it could of Greek thought. But when the Church dissipated its Mediterranean heritage, it placed the emphasis on history to the determinant of nature, caused the Gothic to triumph over the Romance, and destroying a limit in itself, has made increasing claims to temporal power and historical dynamism. When nature ceases to be an object of contemplation and admiration, it can be nothing more than material for an action that aims at transforming it. These tendencies, and not the real strength of mediation, which would have compromised the real strength of Christianity, are triumphing in modern times to the determinant of Christianity itself by an inevitable turn of events. If, as Camus would define it, the choice for this century was between history and nature, somehow we made a very bad bargain when we chose history, because it appears history has come to an end, and we are very close to destroying nature. The religious issue in American society has been developing for several decades. It is not as simple as the old Protestant Catholic competition, nor does it reflect the former Christian Jew diversity. American society now has a bewildering variety of sects and religious traditions. The refugees from the Vietnam War and the intense interest in Asian religions, including the martial arts so well publicized by the movies, have made Asian traditions respectable for the first time in American history. The strong interest in the esoteric traditions, astrology, etc., has broadened out the supermarket of possible religious experiences, so that people feel quite at home chanting a hymn to Osiris if the occasion calls for it. The religious situation today eloquently reflects the American psyche. We create our own reality, and we are absolutely free to do so. This condition, however, suggests that there is no reality, and that we live in a completely intellectual world, where the free choice of the individual determines the values and emotional content of experiences. We are at ground zero religiously, with little possibility of a revelation to enable us to move on. Reaching into this plate of religious linguine and making an orderly analysis are not as impossible as we might suppose, because Camus has properly identified our real choices: history or nature, time or space. While we would like our personal preferences to be realized, if we have any sanity, we must admit that the world outside our perspective has a bit of substance to it, and must certainly be constructed on certain principles, through which history and nature are related. It is therefore our task to examine, with a great deal of seriousness, the possible relationships that these two ideas have, and the probable configuration that a new understanding of history and nature and time and space would give us. For the sake of comparison, let us suggest the possible representatives of history and nature that we can find in America today, and examine what degree of clarity they display that could help us to see new combinations and understandings about the values and directions we must take in solving our social and psychological problems. History must certainly be represented by the Christian churches, the fundamentalists having been disappointed in the recent Gulf War, which many of them felt forecast Armageddon, and consequently supported vigorously. Even the old tired mainline churches, the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, and others still preach in glowing terms about the coming of the kingdom, and the prominent part their respectable members will play in it. Add to this mixture the Republican Party that, by appointing second and third-rate scholars and practitioners to the Supreme Court, believes it is now returning to the original principles of the Constitution. And we have pretty much the advocates of the idea that history is all-important and nature is merely an inert mass to be exploited. Identifying the groups that would naturally fall on the side of nature is more hypothetical. American Indians certainly stand out in this respect, as many quotations in anthologies demonstrate. Animal rights activists would seem to qualify as well, and some of the more militant ecological and conservation organizations. It is difficult to distinguish the conservation groups who really see a value in nature and those who simply want it preserved for the sake of human enjoyment. Regardless of motive or perspective, they are more reliable allies in most causes than are the churches or the political parties. Like the groups that believe in the reality of history, those people who see a value in nature and attempt to tailor their behavior accordingly share a general orientation, and are not committed to any specific articulation of the idea, if, indeed, they are able to derive abstract principles from their experiences. Yet there is a profound difference between American Indians and all of these other groups. The Indian is indigenous, and therefore does not have the psychological burden of establishing his or her right to the land in the deep emotional sense of knowing that he or she belongs there. Nearly half a century ago, Chief Luther Standing Bear of the Sioux tribe commented on the strange feeling of alienation which the intruder experiences and applied his analysis to the American whites as follows. The white man does not understand America. He is too far removed from its formative processes. The roots of the trees of his life have not yet grasped the rock and the soil. The white man is still troubled by primitive fears. He still has in his consciousness the perils of this frontier continent, some of its vastness not yet having yielded to his questioning footsteps and inquiring eyes. He shudders still with the memory of the loss of his forefathers upon its scorching deserts and forbidding mountain tops. The man from Europe is still a foreigner and an alien, and he still hates the man who questioned his oath across the continent. But in the Indian, the spirit of the land is still vested. It will be until other men are able to divine and meet its rhythm. Men must be born and reborn to belong. Their bodies must be formed of the dust of their forefathers' bones. It is significant that many non-Indians have discerned this need to become indigenous and have taken an active role in protecting the environment. The patriotism of the American conservative may be said to be an expression of the effort to become indigenous. Certainly, many Americans chafe at the idea that only Indians should be called Native Americans, and they argue quite properly that anyone born in the United States is a Native American. But their allegiance is to democracy, a powerful idea, but it has no relationship to the earth upon which we walk, and the plains and animals that give us sustenance. Developing a sense of ourselves that would properly balance history and nature and space and time is a more difficult task than we would suspect and involves a radical reevaluation of the way we look at the world around us. Do we continue to exploit the earth, or do we preserve it and preserve life? Whether we are prepared to embark on a painful intellectual journey to discover the parameters of reconciling history and nature is the question of this generation. End of chapter 3.